thanks everyone for joining us today for this Lunch and Learn. I'm really, really pleased to introduce to you Sara Ahern. She's the Programme Manager of the Better Start Bradford Innovation Hub. And she's here this lunchtime to speak to us about introducing theories of change and logic models. So we're going to do just go a half an hour presentation. I'll keep an eye on the chat, and there'll be opportunity for questions at the end, which I'll keep having a look at to make sure that we're not missing anybody. And we are recording this, and it will go on our YouTube channel by the end of the week. I'm going to put the link to our YouTube channel in the chat. And if you subscribe to the YouTube channel, you'll get all the updates about all the different Lunch and Learns, and you'll get a notification about when this Lunch and Learn goes on there as well to share with people. And I'll also put a link in the chat about our new newsletter, so you can subscribe to that as well. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sara for her to do her slides.
Thanks, Kate. Let's just make sure my screen sharing is working. Can everybody see a title slide? Yeah. So lovely to see so many of you join this lunchtime. Thank you very much for taking time out of your day. As Kate said, my plan this afternoon is to talk through theories of change and logic models. And I think this session was sort of lauded as an intro, and it is. It's going to be sort of the basics. But what I sort of figured out from talking to people as I was prepping this session is that I think there's already quite a lot of awareness, at least, of theories of change and logic models. But one of the issues is that these terms seem to be being used interchangeably, which they shouldn't, because they're two separate things. So what I wanted to get out of the session this afternoon was just to refresh our understanding of what the purpose of a theory of a change and a logic model, what the purposes are, think about the key ingredients of both and how to apply them, introduce how the two things relate to each other, because they are very much related, even though they are separate, and then think a little bit more about how the theory of change and logic models support planning for evaluation. So what is a theory of change? At its most basic, a theory of change is a sort of tool or a document that describes why we're doing what we're doing. So it talks about what the problem is, what the current situation is. It helps us to think about where we want to be once we've done our work. I'm just going to move people around on my screen because I can't see my slides. There we go. And it really describes how we're going to get from one thing to the other. So how do we get from the current situation to where we want to be? And really, it's describing mechanisms for change. So a theory of change ideally would be evidence-based, or at least have some base in science. So what theories exist that tell us what we're going to do is actually going to have the impact we want it to have. So that's our theory of change. In terms of a logic model, this is more of a sort of graphic representation of how an intervention or a programme of work should support its intended outcome. So this is really getting into the detail of a service, a strategy, a programme of work, and it demonstrates that pathway between what the key activities are and how it's going to bring about those outcomes. And this is really the foundation for a strong plan for monitoring and evaluation. So theory of change, I like to say, is what tells me this is likely to work, and a logic model, or what we sometimes call a theory of action, is actually what we need to do to make it work. So the two things are very much related, but have two separate functions. So I think of a theory of change as a really strong tool for design and development of any work that we want to take forward. So I've already sort of spoken about what's the problem. By really describing the current situation, the detail, the issues that we are experiencing or observing, it helps us to identify the potential solutions to that problem. So where can we intervene? What opportunities are there for us to do something, and with who? The how will you get there? This is the what are we actually going to do in practice? What do we know works? And what are we going to implement? And that is what supports the development of our logic model. So we can then break that down into key activities of who's going to do what, when are they going to do it, and how often are they going to do it. And then what change do you hope to see? So by identifying where we want to have impact and what impact we want to have, thinking about outcomes, really, this is what supports that monitoring and measurement of impact. The other thing that I think is often missed with the theory of change, and why I really like to use a theory of change, is I think they're a really strong tool for communication. So as well as giving that foundation for monitoring and evaluation and finding out if what we're doing works, it also really helps us to communicate our story to our key stakeholders. So it gives that sort of linear, how are we going to get from where we are now to where we want to be? And when we're thinking about communicating our intentions to funders or to the communities that we want to work with, there is a change, give us that strength in the communication. It breaks it down into a simple way of saying, this is why we're doing what we're doing and this is why we expect it to work. So what I'll do first is talk through the key ingredients of a theory of change before I move on then to talk about logic models. If we take that first question that I've already described, so what's the problem? What we want to know is what the current situation is, and this can be broken down into detail, and this is what gives us that opportunity to look for where we can do something to make a change. So what is the issue that you've identified? What are the causes of the issue? What are the risk factors associated, and who's experiencing those risk factors or most at risk? So it's most basic, it's some form of needs assessment. So you're pulling in the data that you've got, the anecdotal evidence from the services that you're working with. This is what builds up our picture of what's currently happening. Thinking about then, what change do you hope to see? And I usually do it in this order. So we're thinking about where we are now. We want to think about where we want to get to. What is the desired situation? What will have changed once you've done this piece of work, and who will things have changed for? So this is about producing some sort of outcomes framework. Now, the key things that I always want to sort of hammer home when talking about outcomes in a theory of change and a logic model is that they need to be plausible and they need to be measurable. So if we want to use these tools to support evaluation, we need to make sure that it's realistic, and that we've got some source of measure or data for these things. So what is the impact you want to have, but also what impact is reasonable to expect? So often when I've been working with people around theories of change, and we're talking about impact, there is a real sort of wanting to change the world in a short space of time and having quite unrealistic expectations of where you might want to have impact, or just not being realistic in terms of what you can actually measure. So if you're doing an intervention with children at age 2 or 3 and it's a short intervention and you want to deliver this piece of work in 12 months, you also want to deliver your evaluation in that time frame. Looking at outcomes in children at age 5 isn't a plausible or a measurable thing to do, because none of your children will have hit that age at the point that you want to deliver on your evaluation. So it's about thinking about what outcome measures make sense, and actually are you able to implement those measures. In terms of how you're going to get there, this is about the actions that are needed, how are they going to trigger change, who are the key actors in that, and what's key to delivering on your impact. So how will you bring about change and why will it work? In terms of doing this, usually there's some form of sort of intervention mapping. If you've not got a pre-existing off-the-shelf intervention that you're planning on implementing, then there's some intervention development work that's needed. And this is the bit that we then take to move on to developing a logic model or our theory of action. So we then break it down into more detail, but I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. I talked about it being ideally evidence-based and science-based, but when we're thinking about evidence for a theory of change, we're thinking about different things. So we might be using local data, particularly if we're thinking about a needs assessment. What do we already know about our communities, the populations that are experiencing the issues that we've identified? What is the evidence for doing this? We want Ideally, research-based theories on what brings about change. I mean, ideally, it would actually be evidence-based interventions, but we know there aren't too many of those knocking around. So this is an opportunity to look at how we build evidence bases for intervention, sorry. But also thinking about our local experts and stakeholders as sources of evidence as well, people who already deliver services to the communities that we're talking about. People who've delivered something similar and what's gone well and what hasn't gone well, sort of building that in, because what we tend to be doing is developing things at a local level for specific communities. So knowing what's already been done and what's already worked, and also what hasn't worked is useful when we're thinking about developing a theory of change. In terms of applying the ingredients, then I think with both theories of changes and logic models, I've seen so many different ways of presenting them on the page. And actually, it's much less about how you present it and much more about making sure those key ingredients are there. But one example that I'm going to give is something that was developed by the Early Intervention Foundation. So this is quite a linear structure to a theory of change. So on the left, you've got why the intervention is needed, who the intervention is and is not for. Then what the intervention is in the middle, and what the intervention will achieve and why it's important. So our outcomes on the right-hand side. So it just gives a straight line from A to B. What I'm going to do is use one of the interventions that is delivered through the Better Start Bradford programme that I currently work on the evaluation of, just as a way of showing you those key ingredients in action, both for a theory of change and a logic model. So yeah, we've got our what's the problem, how are you going to get there, and what change do you hope to see? This project is called Family Action Perinatal Support, and it is a peer support service for parents who are experiencing mild to moderate depression and anxiety. So I've used this example because I think it's a really nice visual way of presenting a theory of change. All the same ingredients are there, but they're there in a much more engaging format. So if we start on the left-hand side in the yellow circle, what we can see here is the risk factors associated with depression and anxiety. So people who experience domestic abuse, childhood trauma, poor housing, deprivation or social isolation are more at risk of experiencing depression and anxiety. Parents experiencing depression and anxiety are more at risk of demonstrating unresponsive parenting and poor parent-child relationships, and children experiencing poor parent-child relationships are more at risk of poor social and emotional development. So it really just shows you that link between the risk factors, why we need to do something really for these parents experiencing depression and anxiety. And then across the top in green, we've got where there are opportunities to intervene. So the project is taking referrals, assessing them, and using their project to build trust and confidence to access other support services. So they're helping people to actually access services that might help them with some of these risk factors in the yellow circle that they can't directly influence, but they're also matching people with a peer supporter who can do that befriending, provide that emotional support and help them to build new social networks, so reduce isolation, but also providing direct parenting support, so helping to increase that parental responsivity or maternal sensitivity, increasing their confidence in parenting and improving that bond between parent and child. So it's really clear how all of these pieces fit together, and it's a really nice visual theory of change, but it can easily be put back into that linear structure. So we've got X proportion of children have poor social and emotional development, unresponsive parenting and poor parent-child relationships increase the likelihood of that, and parents with anxiety and depression are most at risk of that unresponsive parenting and poor parent-child relationships. So you can add that detail in that's in the visual one, but it's not necessary. We've got our intervention in the middle, so helping them to access relevant services, building supportive social networks and developing responsive parent practices. Again, there's detail that sits behind that. And then we've got what we want to be happening, which is that parents are accessing those relevant services, that they're supported to become more sensitive to children's needs, they're developing better relationships with their children, and children at a reduced risk of poor social and emotional development. That's at a sort of individual intervention level, but this theory of change works really well if we're thinking about whole programs of work as well. So on the left-hand side, you'd have your needs assessment, your outcomes framework on the right, and what you're doing differently in the middle. So what has your needs assessment identified? How is current provision not addressing those needs? Who are you aiming to reach with the changes to your organisation or system? What changes have you decided to make? So what will you be doing differently to support people? So this might be things as high level as thinking about changes to leadership, better joining up of services, introduction of new services, but it's all the information about what's going to be different. It doesn't need to be really detailed in a theory of change. That's where your logic model comes in, but it needs to be that overview of what's going to be happening to bring about the change that you're describing. And then we're thinking about what immediate change do you expect to see? How will that impact on people? And what's the ultimate goal? What outcomes will have improved? So that's your theory of change. And then we come to our logic model. And this is a sort of translation from one thing into the other. So why are we doing what we're doing remains the same. What is the current situation and what are our priorities? Our outcomes should be liftable straight from the theory of change into the logic model as well. But what's different is what sits in this middle bit, the inputs and the outputs. And that's where we're really providing that detail around what it is that we're actually doing. So it summarises what's the current situation, it duplicates our outcomes, but it provides real levels of detail. And I do mean real levels of detail in that central bit. So what are we doing? Who's doing what? And what do we need in order to deliver it? So then in terms of key ingredients of a logic model, we've got our inputs, what do we need to deliver the project, our activities, what are we doing, who's doing what, outputs, sometimes termed participation as well. So what tells us that those inputs and activities are actually happening, and then the outcomes. So what tells us in the short and long term that it's working. So I'm not going to spend too much time because this is repetitive, but just to show you that situation section of the logic model is the same for our family action perinatal support project. And then the intervention. So if I was to describe the intervention to you, the journey or the pathway for parents through family action, we've got referred parents are assessed. Those whose needs sit outside the service, referred into other services. Eligible parents are matched to a volunteer where there's an appropriate match. They receive that one-to-one support, and that could be face-to-face in the home or somewhere else in the community. It could be telephone-based, dependent on parents' needs. They're supported to access other relevant services according to the needs identified at assessment. And then there's also group-based therapeutic work that's available for families where that's appropriate as well, and that's a 6 week course. So that's the intervention in a nutshell. How that translates then into activities, you can see here. So we've got that accepted referrals are assessed by project staff. So you're starting to think about who's doing what within this journey for parents. And the first time we did a logic model for family action, this is what we came up with, and it seems quite brief. And then you start to think about what sits behind some of this. So if we're saying that parents receive one-to-one support from a volunteer, then in order to make this project work, we also need to be thinking about other activities that sit outside of the core intervention. So things like recruitment of volunteers, training of volunteers. We want external organisations to be referring into this project, so we need them to know about it. We need to do engagement activities with these referring organisations. If we want volunteers to stay in the service, we need to make sure that they're happy and feeling supported in their role. So we need to make sure that they're having supervision. So again, we're breaking this down even further into the detail that makes this deliverable as a project. Once we've got our activities, we can then think back to what do we need to deliver on those. So we need a volunteer coordinator. We need somebody who's going to do the engagement work. We need somebody who's going to project manage this. We need the admin support because we say we're doing assessments. Well, how are those assessments getting onto the system? What assessment tools are we using? Have we got the venues to deliver the group therapeutic work? So by having that detail, we're able to keep going back and saying, have we thought about everything, and breaking it down and having a real blueprint, I guess, for the intervention. We can also then translate these activities into what we call outputs. So if we're saying we're recruiting volunteers, have we recruited the number of volunteers that we anticipated? Are we training the number of volunteers? And this level of detail in terms of how are we demonstrating that we're doing what we say we're going to do gives us a really good basis for a monitoring plan. When we set out in the Innovation Hub to do the work with Better Start of evaluating these community-based projects, we developed a sort of evaluation framework which shows you everything that you need to deliver on an evaluation, but also breaks it down into levels of evaluation. So one of the real strengths, I think, to having a logic model when you're setting out on implementing, but also evaluating a project or program of work, is that it allows you to think about building the evaluability of that piece of work. So we always talk about implementation evaluation as being the first level of evaluation that should be done, because if we think about jumping straight to effectiveness without understanding what's actually happening in terms of implementation of a project, we find that the project isn't delivering on outcomes, we might assume that something's not effective, when actually if we look at what's being delivered or not being delivered, it's not being delivered to plan, and had it been, we might be able to say something else about effectiveness. So it's about building like I say, the evaluability of a project and the levels of evidence. So can we do a good implementation of evaluation of this project? Well, if you've got a really strong logic model, then yes, you can. You'll be able to say in great detail about whether you're delivering what you said you were going to deliver, whether it's reaching the people that you want to reach with it, whether you're delivering enough of it consistently enough with the right level of frequency. Once that's been established, you can start to look at those short-term outcomes and thinking about maybe a before and after evaluation, so whether outcomes are improving from the start to the end. And then you can move on to thinking about effectiveness and whether there's any sort of causal effect of your intervention or program of work. So again, this sort of translates from outputs, building an implementation evaluation, short-term outcomes, looking at a before and after evaluation, and then longer term thinking about effectiveness and whether you've demonstrated a causal effect of your intervention or programme. Some of the things that can be overlooked with logic models and theory of changes that I wanted to highlight are actually really key, especially when we're thinking about evaluation. So one of the things that in my experience is most often overlooked is context. And that's because interventions and programs of work aren't implemented in a vacuum. You know, we are doing within the ARC applied research. That means that these things are being implemented in the real world, and there's lots of outside influence on how well they can be delivered, whether they're delivered as planned, and whether they work. So when we're developing theories of changes and logic models, we have to make certain assumptions about that context so that certain things are going to remain in place or static. So things like stakeholder buy-in, organisational support, trying to foresee whether there's local, regional or national policy or priorities that are going to impact on what we're doing. Dependent on how long the piece of work is that you're doing, how long an intervention is or a programme, it's very rare that things remain static and in place for the entire life of them. So having a sort of audit trail, so documenting the assumptions that you're making, allow you to sort of monitor that external context as well, and also to revisit then your theory of change or your logic model in light of those contextual changes. The other thing is thinking of logic models and theories of change as living documents. Logic models in particular support good quality monitoring, and that gives you that sort of opportunity for test and learn. So ongoing learning within the life of the intervention and programme. but also within the life of the evaluation. So you can address issues and adapt quickly without having to wait to have completed the full evaluation. So you can address issues head on and quicker. So then thinking of the theories of change and logic models of living documents means that they should be being reviewed regularly in light of this sort of test and learn approach that you're taking. It's not a one-time exercise. When you get to the end of an evaluation, it's quite likely that you might be changing your logic model slightly, or even going back to your theory of change and saying, we made assumptions here, we thought this was going to work a certain way and it hasn't. And then the final one that I just wanted to talk about was about ownership and accountability, I guess. I think theories of change and logic models, I always advocate for them not being developed in isolation. It's not somebody sat at their desk writing a theory of change for an intervention or programme of work. They should be developed collaboratively and with all the key stakeholders there. Because you're bringing in that expertise and that local evidence in terms of your design and development. But also, I think the theory of change and logic model provide a bit of a commitment to deliver as planned. Being able to have that monitoring and evaluation plan also offers that accountability to our stakeholders. And again, that also means that the reviewing of the document should be done collaboratively as well as just the development. So this has been a really whistle-stop tour, I think, of the logic models and theories of changes, and there's so much more I could have covered in a session, and I'm sure there's lots of questions and discussion, but just to sort of point you in the direction of where further information is. A lot of the work that we have done within the Innovation Hub is based on previous work that's been done by the Early Intervention Foundation. So they've got a great guide on 10 steps for evaluation success that includes some of these things, including theories of change and logic model. And we also have, over the lifetime of the Better Start Bradford programme, been developing toolkits around service design, implementation and monitoring and evaluation that bring all of these things together. So they're available on the website as well. But I'm going to try and stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really interesting. I'm sure people have got questions. So if you can use the raising your hand function on Zoom, that would be great. And we can have a look and see if anyone's got any questions. You must have covered it so well, Sarah.
Bummed everyone into silence.
Could I just ask a question? Sorry, I've just joined a bit really late. Will this webinar be recorded? Is it possible to listen to it again?
Yes, it will, Donna. I've already put in the chat. If you have a look in the chat, there's a link to our Yorkshire and Humber YouTube channel. So it'll be on there probably by the end of the week. But if you subscribe to that YouTube channel, you'll also get all the notifications about things going on.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks.
No problem. And there's also the link to subscribe to our newsletter as well, which we generally put in all the lunch and learns that have happened previously before that's come out as well.
Right. I'm just looking in the chat. Messages. Okay. You said you put something in the chat, have you? I don't see.
You can only see in the chat from when you joined, so we'll just need to repost it, Kate.
Fine. I'll repost it. That's not a problem.
Right. Okay.
It should be coming through for you now.
Yes, I see it. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Great. Thank you very much. Ooh, everything's going so fast.
Has anyone else got any questions for Sarah while she's here? We've got some comments in the chat now. You can put, if you don't want to say your questions out loud as well, please feel free to put them in the chat. So I've got a question for you, Sarah, which is from Jess, which is, with theories of change and logic models, what's involved in the decision-making process of what to take from what, if that makes sense?
In terms of what to take from what, so in terms of whether to use both or whether to stick to a theory of change or a logic model, or have I misunderstood?
Jess, are you able to expand on your question at all?
Yeah, that's right. That's what I was wondering about. Thank you.
Yeah, so what we tend to find is that there's one or other that are used, but I would always advocate for both. So if you're being asked for a logic model, I would suggest just an exercise of pulling your theory of change together first would help you to develop that logic model. Generally, it comes from funders. They tend to specify one or the other, but I think one of the issues is, without being overcritical of anybody, is that there is a bit of a misunderstanding and a tendency to use them interchangeably. So actually they might ask for a theory of change, but what they mean is a logic model and vice versa. So having both, I think, helps you to cover all bases. You've got your theory of change, which provides the description of those mechanisms and why you've chosen to do what you're going to do. And then you've got your logic model, which breaks that down and provides the monitoring and evaluation foundation there as well. So I would always say both, even if you're just being asked for one, because I think it helps you to have them both in place.
That's lovely. Thank you, Sarah. Does that answer your question, Jess?
It does, thank you.
Brilliant. Has anyone else got any questions?
Yes, could I ask a question? I'm just coming up to organising a theory of change workshop. Well, no, a program theory workshop. That's what I've understood it as from the reading that I've done thus far. And my understanding is that you have a theory of change, which is, as you said, the mechanisms. So you're trying to find the mechanisms, but you also have a theory of action of the dose of the different activities that the organization is doing that should hopefully activate the changes, so make the mechanisms kind of work to get them to the outcomes and the impact. Is that right? Am I on the right track with that?
Yeah, it's exactly right. And I think
Okay, that's good.
theory of action and logic models can sometimes be used interchangeably, and that kind of is because they are
Yeah.
the same thing. So yeah, your theory of action is the intervention that you've described in your theory of change or your program of work, just broken down into the core elements that are needed, like you say, to trigger that change, to make the change. So it's the detail, it's the blueprint of what actually is going to be happening, who's going to be doing what, how often are they going to do it, where are they going to do it. Yeah.
See, because I've just got a list of the different activities that an organisation has been doing. And I've been asked to create a crude logic model that we can then take to the workshop to ask participants to then kind of elaborate on and pull apart and tell us, for example, they've run an event day. So how many times are they going to do that, and at what frequencies, and what are the outcomes going to be from that? Is that right? Is it potentially possible to create a crude logic model from a list of just the activities that they've done?
Yeah.
I don't know how frequently they're doing things or who's involved or how it's working. Do you see what I mean? All I've got is the list.
Yeah, I'd be tempted to get a template of a logic model, throw those activities in there, and then use that as a basis of the discussion with them during the workshop. Because what you want to do is to make sure that the activities that are listed are broken down to their most basic level. And then, like you say, who's doing what, and getting all that detail that sits behind it. So when I say it's not a sort of individual desk exercise, there are parts of the process that could be somebody sat at their computer with a list of things trying to populate a template, but that's not that's the start of the process rather than the end of the process.
So that's me doing that initially. Right, okay, thank you very much, that's really useful.
Thank you, Donna, that's great. We've also got another question in the chat, which is, oh, here we go, another one from Jess, and she's put, would the trans-theoretical model / stages of change model by Prochaska and De Clementi be considered type of logic model? And she's gone on to say, she sort of feels like it isn't, because it hasn't got specific inputs, outputs, etc., like the model you showed, but maybe more theory of change, but presented visually?
That's a very specific question. I can't say I'm familiar, but by the way that you've described it, I'd be more likely to put it in a theory of change bracket. And like I say, I think what we tend to get bogged down with is the presentation of some of these things. I think logic models, there tends to be a fairly uniform way of presenting them. I think theories of change, as long as all of the ingredients are in there, and somebody can look at it and understand, I can see why you're doing what you're doing. I can see why you're expecting what you're doing to have an impact, and I can see the impact that you're intending to have. I think it's a theory of change. The detail is what is where the logic model comes in.
Can I just pipe in there? Because I'm reading a really useful book, just to respond to the lady's question about Procrastinator and De Clemente's stages of change. The book Purposeful Program Theory by Sue Funnell and Patricia Rogers is really useful, and it mentions the theory of planned action and several other theories that are useful for making sense of the change process. So to help you to develop the theory of change, I think that's the one. So yeah, I'd recommend that, because that's what I'm trying to digest in a short space of time.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Thanks, Donna. Nicola has asked, Sarah, are you happy for us to share the slides as well as the recording?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll make sure they get sent round with the link to the recording as well to everybody. Has anyone else got any questions? Just having a look to see whether anyone's got their hand up. No, I don't think so. This is your last chance, everyone. Right. Lovely. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. We really appreciate you giving your time today to give us that insight into theories of change and logic models. If anyone wants to get in touch with Sarah, I can put our generic Yorkshire and Humber email address in the chat, so you've got that in case you want to get in touch with anyone and we can help sort of field those queries through. And in the next couple of days, we'll send around the link to the recording, and we'll also send around the slides as well. So thanks very much. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.